So, kia ora everyone, welcome to this webinar. I'm Laura, I'm from the School of System Change, but before we start, I'm just going to hand over to Abby, who's going to do a karakia for us so that we can start with that. So over to you, Abby, to start off with.
Kia ora koutou. So because we're doing this in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's part of Māori protocol to start and open and close something like this with a karakia or a prayer, I'm going to be doing that today. And I'll do it first in Māori and then in English for those of you who aren't from Aotearoa and won't know what I'm talking about. So here we go. Whakatake te hau ki te uru, whakatake te hau ki te taonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he mauri ora. What that means is cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Abby, and that's a really lovely start, partly because I'm actually in France and I can see the red-tipped dawn out of my window here, so that's a really nice connection into particularly where I'm sitting first thing this morning. I'm really excited to join all of you for whom it's later in the day. And so we're going to start with a few introductions, but just a couple of tech questions. We've set this up, as you will have seen, as a meeting rather than a webinar so that we can have a much more interactive session. So thank you for those of you who've put your videos on. You're welcome, obviously, to keep them off through most of the meeting if that works for you. There will be a little breakout session later on, and we'd suggest that maybe we do have the videos on so that you can have those little group discussions. You might also want to just change your name on Zoom to something that looks like a real name. I think most of you have done, but sometimes we have the sort of AC 47002 type thing, which doesn't really help when people want to say something or kind of participate. So if you want to do that, that would be great. We have about an hour together, and we're going to start with a few introductions, words of welcome, where this comes from, and then I'll take us through an introduction to one of the frameworks that we use at the School of System Change, really start us thinking about how change happens. We've got a little video to share with you, should be quite fun. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some breakout groups and try and get it a little bit more participatory in the second half of the hour, but I'm sure it'll go pretty quickly, and we're very pleased to have so many of you here today. So as we move over to just intros and kind of the little bit of the framing for this webinar, we're also going to run a Zoom poll. So Ariana, if you'd like to share that. This is just to get a sense of who's in the room with us. So if you'd like to answer, and then we can see who's here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from different sectors, just so that we get a sense of that. Thanks so much. So I'm Laura, I'm head of the School of System Change at Forum for the Future. Forum is an international NGO. We've been around for over 20 years, and we work with business, civil society and government on addressing complex sustainability challenges across the world. And one of our sort of specific ways of working is that we use systems approaches. So we do that through working individually with organizations, working in collaborative settings on sort of big global challenges, and also equipping people and organizations to really start thinking and acting with systems approaches to make more progress towards a sustainable future. And that's kind of the arm that I'm in charge of with what we call the School of System Change. So really pleased to be setting off this webinar, which is kind of our first foray into the community of systems practitioners in New Zealand. And we'd really love this to catalyze the conversation around what does this mean, this systemic practice, for the challenges that we're particularly facing in New Zealand and in this part of the world. And this has come about through a wonderful partnership. So I'd love to hand over to our partners, Abby Reynolds and Lanny Evans, who are going to say a couple of words about where this idea came from and some of the intention that we've set together. So Abby, I can see you're there. Did you want to say a couple of words for us?
Thank you very much, Laura. So for those who don't know me, ko Abby Reynolds tōku ingoa. On Monday, I will be starting as the CEO of Predator Free 2050 Limited, but some of you know me from my previous role as the Executive Director at the Sustainable Business Council here in New Zealand. Lani Evans, who is the head of the Vodafone Foundation and hopefully is on the line and will follow me on this, had a conversation about a year ago about what some of the learning that we wanted to do for ourselves and the people who are in our networks were. And we landed on this conversation about systems change as something we'd both been playing with, but didn't feel like we necessarily had enough of the knowledge to be able to talk to other people about it. And it so happened that Ariel from Forum for the Future was in the country around the same time. And I talked to her about this. And from those kind of very slight beginnings came about the idea to be able to do this with the School of Systems Change. So for me, super grateful for Lani even asking the question about what development might be useful for those of us who are in this space, and also for Ariel making a suggestion and connecting us with Laura. So that's a little bit of the background of where this came from and how I happen to be involved. Lani, if you're on, I'd really like to invite you to talk about kind of the role that you played in bringing the philanthropists and the more of the community sector, because what's unique about this is it's a wonderful reach out to people in the not-for-profit and community sector, as well as people in corporate sustainability. And there's so much intersection in those groups that's one of the things which makes me really delighted about the people we have on the call today. So Lani, over to you if you're here. And she may not be yet. Lani, if you're here, you'll get a chance to jump in later, I hope. But since you don't seem to be, a little bit, Lani is the head of the Vodafone Foundation, and through her very excellent offices worked with J R McKenzie Trust and the Todd Foundation to pull together some philanthropists to fund this work, to make sure that we could make this available to as many people in New Zealand as possible for free. So just think that's a really wonderful investment by our philanthropic trusts in New Zealand. So thank you very much to the teams from Vodafone Foundation, J R McKenzie Trust and the Todd Foundation. Hopefully you guys are on the line to hear this, and we might get to hear from Lani a bit. I'll hand back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Abby, and absolutely, Lani will give you the chance to speak a little bit later when you're ready. So just before I kind of launch in, we had this little poll. Thanks everyone for filling it in. And so Oriana, can you share the results for us just so that everyone can see? We've got people from really different sectors here today, and you know, we've got business at 30%, but actually civil society, charity and not-profit are kind of another 30, and then some people from government, from academia, students and just interested parties. So welcome to absolutely everyone. And I think this is already great to see for us how many different types of people and backgrounds we're going to have in the discussion. That's one of the things that's really important to us when we're doing systems change work, is to think that actually, you know, it's not just one kind of actor that can change a system. So lovely to see the spread of people here today. Thank you, Oriana, for sharing that. So just in terms of the other two people who are going to help facilitate this, we'll have, so Oriana, did you just want to say a quick hello so people can see who you are? And then Ariel, who is our managing director of our Asia Pacific office, who was also absolutely instrumental in the conversation. And we'll hear from Ariel a bit later on about how she uses this framework I'm going to introduce in her work in Asia Pacific. So that's great. And also welcome to everyone else from different places in the world, not in New Zealand. I can see some people from India and other colleagues who are here as well. So lovely to recognize that we're based in Aotearoa this morning, but well, this evening, but there are other people from other places in the world as well, and you're all very welcome. So I'm going to start us off with a little bit of an intro to why systems change. And for us at Forum for the Future, we moved into this system change approach about 10 years ago, when we realized that actually, although we were working with sectors, the transformation that we're really wanting to see towards a sustainable future wasn't getting us where we felt that we wanted to be after, 10 years of working with big corporate businesses, governments, civil society on some of these big challenges. And we got interested in a sort of field of practice that's actually been around for, 30 to 50 years now, called systems thinking, and which has started to move into a space of systems change. So how we use systems thinking to actually, decide on strategies and actions towards a sustainable future. And one of the sort of core people who really launched this was Donella Meadows. And Donella Meadows is a US thought leader and systems practitioner. She was very much involved with the systems dynamics team at MIT. She was one of the co-authors of the Limits to Growth report, which was written in the 1970s and which was absolutely seminal in terms of some of the sustainable development thinking in terms of limits to the natural world and how we could start moving ourselves onto a different track. And Donella Meadows said in one of her articles, actually this was published posthumously, so that's why the date's quite recent. She said this, and for us it just really encapsulates why we would start thinking about systems change, taking a systemic approach to some of our big global challenges. So I'm just going to read it out because for me it just really kind of resonates in terms of where our starting point is for this work. So Donella said, the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. And we treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. So this is quite a powerful quote, but we also wanted just to recognize that the we in this quote is very much a we from societies and people who are influenced by European Enlightenment thinking and sort of the machine metaphors and Newtonian physics that have led us to kind of think about the world as if cause and effect were very linear, and as if we can really take things apart and understand them by taking them and looking at them separately rather than as a whole. So I want to recognize that, the we that we use in systems thinking is different in different places in the world. And I particularly want to recognize that with the people who are in this room, because we do have different cultures and mindsets who perhaps don't consider the world in this way as if it were divisible and separable. However, our global economies have really been built on this heritage of this European thinking. And we are hoping that in some ways systems change and this field of practice is a response to this mismatch that Donella Meadows was talking about, and which is a way in which we can reconnect with the complexity of the world. We can start to connect into our own understanding of interconnectedness. And we also think that, as people, we are all, involved in families. We are all connected into living systems. And sometimes we're just not very good at bringing that awareness and that understanding of the world into our professional work and into the projects that we're working on to sort of move into a sustainable future. So for us, we're trying to think about what are the different practices, what are the capabilities that we need to be able to understand and work with the world in this complex and interconnected way. And we're seeing that at the moment, this is a very special time, that actually the awareness of this interconnectedness has really changed over the last few months with COVID. And there's a sense that there's kind of a window of opportunity here to really think about, well, how might we go about working differently in the face of these global challenges? And so what we do at the School of System Change is we work with multiple practitioners and thinkers from all over the world and from very different sort of fields of practice, but who have in common the idea that they're working with some systemic understanding of the world and that they're looking to also create systemic change. So really big, ambitious change in the world. And the way that we would get there is to really think about how we can work using systems approaches. So I'm not going to go through all of these sort of different pieces on this wheel. We call this our wheel of system change practices. But basically it's to say there's no one way to do this. If we think about the world as being complex, the way that we're responding to that is also going to be, testing and experimenting with different approaches. And we've gathered these sort of 10, I guess, chapters of systemic practice from our work with all of the practitioners across the world. And we try and use frameworks as a way of helping us navigate this complexity and really think about, well, how do we understand the world differently? And that's what we're going to look in today, is a framework called the multi-level perspective that really helps us understand how change is happening at different levels and different scales. So you can see that here on the wheel, that one of the practices is to work at different levels concurrently. And that's particularly what we're going to focus into today with this framework around the multi-level perspective. And the way that I'm going to introduce that is through a story. So we often find that the big complex global challenges that we're looking at, they can be quite heavy. They can be, quite difficult to get your head around. And sometimes it's important to use narratives and stories to really kind of reconnect us and help us understand how change happens without getting too bogged down in the sort of the urgency of the climate crisis or some of the deep inequalities that we're trying to face. And so for this framework, we've developed what we call a story of change, which is a little video that helps us understand this framework through a story that lots of us can connect to, and which is perhaps a little bit more fun. So this is going to be about the breakthrough of rock and roll and what that can tell us about how change happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a small video. It's just about 2 minutes long. I'd invite you, just before we go into that, to think about what are your assumptions about how rock and roll came about. Obviously, we've got an image here with Elvis, so to get you into the mood, but just have a minute just to think about what are the different factors that moved the music industry from a place where there wasn't rock and roll into this very different phase of its development and its change. So just have a little minute to go into that while I set up our video. So I hope you enjoyed that. Just a little fun video to help us think about what happened and how change actually came about in the music industry. This comes from a field of practice called sustainable transitions. So it's a whole field of academic research and development of methodologies into what we call transition management. This quote is from one of the proponents of this academic tradition, and is just helping us understand about how all of the different factors come together into creating change. So we talk about a transition as a radical structural change, but that is a result of a co-evolution of economic, cultural, technological, ecological, and institutional developments at different scale levels. So again, that's one of these sort of long quotes with lots of commas in it, but there's something about understanding change as happening as a co-evolution of different events and elements that are coming together. And really that's what we're trying to look at through this story of rock and roll. Often when we do this in a sort of live setting, we'll ask people, you know, how did rock and roll come about? And we'll hear, you know, oh, Elvis Presley, or the electric guitar, or you know, the rise of the teenager. And all of these elements are really important, but what we're interested in is how did they come together, and how did we see these different factors, very different change from, you know, both the sort of wider economic landscape and also through technological and social innovation, come together to create the opportunity for this whole new form of music to emerge. And the framework that's behind this thinking is called the multi-level perspective. It's a fairly simple framework. And what we love about some of these system change approaches is that actually, you know, they're really not complex in their organization, and they're there to help us navigate complexity. They're there to help us sort of be able to get everything on the page and understand how different factors are interacting together. They kind of help us scan a story, a situation, understand a complex challenge by bringing some things to the fore and maybe letting other things that aren't so important go into the background, but really think about how do we organize this complexity? And in this particular framework, we have the use of 3 levels to try and understand where change is coming from. So the regime is the mainstream. In this instance, it's the music industry. It's really the day-to-day, the business as usual, the dominant culture and practice of that particular system. And then it's going to be changed by the influence of landscape level change, which is going to be, you know, the operating context, the big economic, cultural, sort of perhaps global developments and mega trends. And it's also going to be influenced from things at the margins, from things at the niche. So often in this particular framework, we look for social and technical innovations that are coming in and changing the situation. And in a minute, we're going to have Ariel speak to how she uses this framework in her work, but we're just going to talk through the story a little bit so we can see what it looks like to actually analyze a system through this kind of approach. The first thing that we'll do is, you know, it helps us challenge the myth of the hero, looking for the, you know, this kind of magic solution, the one thing that's going to make change happen. In this case, sometimes we'd say, you know, Elvis Presley or the electric guitar. And what it helps us do is understand that there are going to be multiple factors that are coming in to create change, and that they're not necessarily coming from the mainstream or coming from someone who is going to be, you know, really leading change deliberately from the center of the stage. One of the other things that we're going to understand is that it didn't emerge overnight. So, you know, we go right back into the history of the economic turndown in the 1930s. We go back to references to what's going on in music much earlier on, and that's influencing the different styles and music that's coming about. We're looking at cultural factors of, you know, practices around listening to a radio as a family and how that's going to change with the rise of television. So, you know, that's not even in the music industry. Television was audiovisual, but it meant that the teenagers could have their radios and take them into the garage, into the bedroom, into their own space. So we're looking at sort of social innovations as well that are coming and influencing this change. And when we pull everything together, we're seeing that actually a system, so in this case, the music system, is being influenced as the result of a broader societal, political, technological change process. So we're really trying to understand how these different pieces all come together and can create a new pattern or structure in a system. When we talk about systems change, we're trying to think about something that is a radical structural change in the system, something that you can't reverse, that even if you take out the main actor, if you took away Elvis Presley, you could say, well, you know, rock and roll would have emerged differently, but it would have emerged all the same because of all of the different factors that are coming together to really create this new pattern in the system. And so at this point, I thought it was helpful if we could have a little conversation with Ariel, not about rock and roll, but about how we use this framework when we're trying to think about big sustainability challenges, not necessarily the music industry. I'm also aware, Oriana, that there are things going on in the chat, and I'm not focusing on that. So if there are any questions or things that we really need to address, then can you just flag that for me? That would be really helpful. So Ariel, you're our Managing Director of the office in APAC. Did you want to just say a few words of intro? And then you're going to talk to us a bit about how you've used this in your work.
Sure. Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone who's here today, and to Lonnie and to Abby. It's really exciting to be having this conversation. And I thought, we thought that actually the sort of, okay, how do I use it and what's the kind of case study story would be really valuable. So we use this framework along with a suite of systems change tools with a lot of our partners. And I thought the story I would share was with the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, or AVPN. And AVPN their goal is to essentially build an ecosystem of partners in venture capital and philanthropy to increase the flow of capital into the social sector. And they have a number of different platforms on which they'll focus. So they have one that's focused on health. They just launched one that's focused on COVID, and they have one that's focused on climate action. So Sumi, who's also, I believe, on the call, and I ran a workshop, and we had 3 hours, which is one of the realities of our of doing this type of work, is generally you get squeezed down to a very short amount of time in order to talk about very big topics. And our goal was twofold. One, how do we develop the capacity of those in the room at AVPN to think like systems thinkers? So it wasn't to give them an answer by any means, it was to build their own capacity. And then in so doing, how do we give them insight on how they might think about the role of AVPN as enabling systems change, as leveraging that role of an ecosystem builder that wants to impact and accelerate action on climate and investment into climate. So we did a general introduction to systems thinking, it's just similar to what Laura has shared with you now. And then did an interactive exercise where they essentially mapped the climate finance system onto the MLP. So they considered what were the landscape pressures that were changing that regime, and that regime being traditional finance that we want to begin to shift towards climate finance. And then what are the niche innovations that they're beginning to see. And what I observed in that was one, that you can begin to make sense of the signals that you're seeing externally in a space, that even perhaps more importantly, you and your colleagues have a shared language for those signals. And I think that's one of the things that I love most about these types of tools, is that within a relatively brief amount of time, you can begin to have a shared language for how you see change happening. Where do you see it disrupting? Where do you see the regime beginning to shift? It also then becomes a diagnosis tool, because you can think, well, we're beginning to see the disruption here. How might we begin to amplify that disruption? What activities or partnerships might we use then to amplify that action or dampen another action. We had presented this tool with Donella Meadows' 12 levers of change. And often when we're running workshops, we'll sort of have a toolbox of different systems change tools. So then the participants got to think about how might they use those 12 levers as an intervention that they could begin to shift the system towards the outcomes they wanted to create. And I was reflecting on one of the things that I think the kind of takeaway from that session was that there was I think she was an intern, or she was relatively young within the group. And in terms of niche innovations, she's talked about blockchain and how actually blockchain was going to disrupt banking in and of itself. So not just climate finance, but disrupt the regime of banking. And what I loved about that is how it catalyzed an entirely new conversation about what the future might hold in terms of shifting the climate finance system. And also that it speaks to the value of having diversity in the room when you begin to think about what will enable systems change. So that's my quick whistle-stop tour of sort of what the practicalities of applying it, and in this instance, how it helped to build this group's skills and systems thinking. And you could begin to see them say, okay, what might be our strategy going forward, given what we learned from this diagnosis tool? Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. I think that really brings it to life a little bit about how we go about using these just as, you know, really great ways to have a conversation about how we can think more systemically about some of the challenges that we're facing. And, you know, you're bringing in there some of the other systemic practices that we had earlier in the wheel, you know, the importance of working with multiple perspectives, the importance of understanding, activating and resisting forces for change and that kind of thing. So that's great. So what we're going to do next is we're going to put you into some little breakout rooms. So this is just an opportunity because we wanted to make this interactive, and there are about 100 of us on here, so it's kind of quite hard to have a big group conversation. We'd be thinking, you know, maybe we'd take like 2-3 questions, but we'd really love to also catalyze a conversation around this, about systems change and what this means in your context. So Oriana's going to put us into random breakout rooms of 4 people, and you'll have 8 minutes, which we hope is enough for you to sort of say hello to each other, and then also have a little conversation about what this has sparked for you in regards to how you think about change happening. You know, like, what does this conversation or Ariel's example or this framework, how does this sort of spark something for you about the understanding of how change happens? And then we'll come back together after those 8 minutes, and we'll ask you, someone from the group, just to post maybe one of your key insights or something that surprised you, or a question that you might have, into the chat, and we'll use that as a way to kind of understand and harvest a little bit what your conversations were about. And then hopefully we'll have some time for maybe 2 or 3 people to go into a bit more detail about their conversation or ask a question, and Ariel and I can respond to that before we close up our webinar today. So Oriana, I think over to you in terms of setting us up for our breakout rooms. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a nice conversation. And I realize that 8 minutes is probably quite short to just say hi and have a bit of a chat about things. What we'd love to do at this point is, we've got about 25 different rooms there with the conversations. So our suggestion is that if one of the people from each of the rooms wants to put something in the chat, maybe, as I said, something that stood out for you in the conversation, a question that you guys were holding, one of the insights that you had through either the presentation or through Ariel's story, or through the conversation that you had, that would just help us see a little bit what's been going on in these breakout rooms. They're often kind of a bit of a black box. So we would invite each of you to put a little something in the chat, and then Oriana can sort of scan that for us and see whether there are any patterns in the conversation. And we've just got enough time for perhaps 2 or 3 people just to If you'd like to speak up and talk to us a little bit about what you were saying in your room, and anything that you wanted to kind of share with the wider group, some of the insights around this. I'm just moving around because I have the sunrise in my face now. So feel free to take a minute just to write in the chat something that came out from your conversation, something that struck you.
Thank you, Laura. Just waiting for people to put some comments in. So insight from room 25. Systems change working best at a local level, place-based solutions. The power of this framework is to help those engaged to see the whole living ecosystem more clearly and to consider how they might contribute to leveraging change more effectively. Using this to look at the past, it's a powerful way to lift the gaze and get people to think about the long term and the whole system. Framework prompted thoughts on actors in the margins of the niche. Sophisticated model of change increases the opportunities for creative intervention. The AWA of change, also from breakout group 25. Hard to guess or gauge the scope of the system, so where to start. This is a starting place. Translating the tool into different contexts could be a challenge. Awa is a river in Maori, thank you. In New Zealand, Indigenous people have long understood the world holistically. 200 years of colonization has brought compartmentalization, which we now have to unpick. Building alliance with diverse, broad-based organization to engage with people across different levels, to negotiate with decision makers to change policy, impact on poverty. Making the system visible to help people see change quickly. Framework introduces a time trajectory rather than something static.
Thank you, everybody. That's really great to see some of these wonderful reflections and get some of the sort of insights into the conversations that you had, and also bringing out the connection to your own work and to the Murray practice as well here, which I think is a very important part of this conversation. Did anyone want to, take the floor? Does anyone have something they want to develop a little bit more? We can see in these insights that you're sharing, and there are some questions around how we use the framework. There's some questions about the time, like it's been used to analyze the past. It can be used to think about the present. Is it a tool that we use for the future? How we're bringing in diverse perspectives, how it helps look at both, different levels of change and not just focus on the particular part of the system that you might be involved with in your work. So just looking to niche innovations, for example. But is there anyone who wanted to sort of step in and share something that particularly stood out for them from their conversation? And we can just have a bit of a chat with Ariel about that before we wrap up. Otherwise, I'm very happy to also answer some of the questions here about what this framework's good for and what it's not good for. Because I think, again, one of the key things Ariel brought out is that we often need to use different frameworks and tools to get to a full picture of the system that we're working with, and then also the future possibilities. Alison, go for it. You raised your hand. Are you able to unmute? You should be able to.
Yes. I was just reflecting that I think no matter what problem you're working on or what structure you're using, sort of what frame, this was a really good reminder around keeping in mind the real macro trends that are going on around you and the weak signals that might be coming in and affecting the thing that you're looking at. And I think that's a really good reminder to keep both of those lenses in mind, even if you're not using this particular frame to analyze the system change that you're looking at or wanting to achieve. So yeah, I thought that was particularly useful.
I would just add that on the signals piece too, I think there's a tendency to think that signals only come from the niche, but actually there's signals of change within the regime. So policy change, different types of changes in the regime, and to be observing and watching for those as well. Because I've noticed there's a tendency just to think innovation comes from the niche, but actually it's how are you thinking across all three levels.
Great, thank you, Alison. There's a couple of things in the chat here. So a few people have said, you know, interested to hear what it's good for and what it's less good for and how we combine it with other frameworks. So as I said, this comes from a field of practice around sustainability transitions, which is really about observing how societal systems, as they call them, so how society or societal subsystems, it might be mobility or energy or the food system, how they've evolved in the past and how we can understand the dynamics of change that are going on. But it's not a futures tool. So I guess one of the things that we would definitely do is that we would use this, as Ariel was saying, as a diagnostic tool to really understand maybe, you know, what's been going on in the past in the system, and then also what's going on now. So what are these signals of change? What are these landscape level trends? Who the stakeholders are? What are the practices in the regime? What's the sort of dominant culture? Some of the system structures that are there. And you can think about where's change coming from, but it's not really going to help you think about pathways to the future. And so that's somewhere we would bring in more specifically futures tools. And there's a whole battery of tools, and some of the ones that we like to use are really thinking about futures not as being about predicting or like this is the linear pathway to the future, but really understanding what the different pathways are and what can affect, what kind of choices can affect which scenario we might end up in. So at Forum for the Future, we always use futures tools that help present multiple futures and then help organizations and collaboratives work towards what's the desirable future that we want. So a couple of those might be scenario work, or they might be one that we call 3 horizons, for example, which helps us think about waves of change over time and what the kind of the vision is into the future. So I think there's also something about one of the comments here in the chat was it's quite macro, so it's a starting point. Like Ariel said, we use this if we've got 3 hours with 20 people who need to kind of get a shared language and start understanding something. It doesn't help us really dig into the detail of the interconnections and the interplay between these different change factors. And there we might get into something that's more like a tool for systems mapping. So again, there are multiple tools in that space, but we might use a multiple cause diagram or a causal loop diagram, something from the systems dynamics field that would help us get more into what are the interconnections and the cause and effect between these different pieces. So that's just a bit of an intro. We are going to take a few minutes to sort of wrap up the conversation today because we want to make sure that we finish on time. But we did want to mention that, you know, we'll be bringing in some of these other frameworks in the follow-up webinars that we're running. So I wanted to make sure that we'll have time to say that we'll share, we've got a worksheet that we use around this framework. We can share the video of the webinar and obviously the link to the video itself in the materials. There's a bit of a blog article that talks us through this story of change. And we would love to invite you to participate in the 2 upcoming webinars, one of which is around the Iceberg Model. So that's a model that helps us kind of dig down deeper into the reasons and causes of change. And that's a story of the civil rights movement in the US. And then there's another one from a field of practice called regenerative practice, which is thinking about living systems and what we can learn around the multiple levels on which living systems change and evolve to influence our choices and our change work towards sustainability. Those two are coming up in the next few weeks. So at this point, I guess we'll just say our thank yous and our goodbyes. We wanted to mention again that we had, really appreciated the support from the Vodafone Aotearoa Foundation, the J R McKenzie Trust, and the Todd Foundation in making this happen and available for everyone, this webinar series, so that we can really catalyze a wider conversation around this. And we wanted to finish with karakia just to close our webinar today. So Abby, I'll hand over to you again just to really close the space for us.
Thank you, Laura. So just finishing off with, again, for those who weren't at the beginning, this is part of the way that our Māori colleagues will open and close meetings, is to make sure we create a good space. And so I'm going to close with a karakia, which is a type of prayer. I'll do it first in Māori and then I'll do it in English for those who don't understand, like me, because many of us are still on our te reo journey. So, anuhia, anuhia, anuhia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua e te ara tākata. Koia ra e rongo, whakaria ake ki runga. Kia tina, tina, hui e, tae ki e. And what that means is draw on, draw on. Draw on the supreme sacredness to clear, to free the heart, the body, and the spirit of mankind. Rongo, suspended high above us. Draw together, affirm.
Thanks everyone. Seeing all the thank yous in the chat as well. And we look forward to hopefully seeing a lot of you at the follow-up webinars in October. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Kia ora.
Ka kite.